In the early 1930s, one man handed Adolf Hitler enough political funding to transform a fringe movement into the most catastrophic regime in modern history. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a fanatic. He was a businessman, the richest industrialist in Germany, heir to a steel empire so vast it powered entire nations, a man whose family name was synonymous with wealth so immense that even J.P. Morgan reportedly called him a peer. His name was Fritz Thyssen, and at the height of his power, his personal fortune exceeded the GDP of several European countries combined. The Thyssen steel conglomerate, the Vereinigte Stahlwerke, produced more steel than Britain's entire industry. His family had spent 60 years building the most formidable industrial dynasty on the European continent. Mines, mills, railroads, banks, a vertical empire that stretched from the coal seams beneath the Ruhr Valley to the boardrooms of New York, and he handed it all, his influence, his credibility, his money, to a failed painter from Austria who promised order from chaos. But here's what most people don't know. Fritz Thyssen didn't just fund Hitler's rise. He wrote a book confessing it, then spent the rest of his life desperately trying to distance himself from what he'd done. His family buried the truth under layers of offshore accounts, neutral country banks, and legal maneuvering that took investigators 70 years to untangle. The wealth didn't disappear when the Reich collapsed. It quietly migrated to Switzerland, to Argentina, to New York, where it shaped dynasties and financed institutions that still exist today. This is the story of the Thyssen family. It is a story about steel and power and the seductive logic of political investment. It is a story about how the wealthiest families in the world don't just respond to history. They sometimes write its most devastating chapters. And it begins, like so many catastrophes do, with ambition. By the time the Second World War ended in 1945, Fritz Thyssen was a broken man, sitting in an Allied detention camp, stripped of most of his assets, waiting to learn what justice would look like for someone who had helped make the whole catastrophe possible. He was 72 years old. He'd spent the last years of the war in a Nazi concentration camp himself, not as a victim of ideology, but as a consequence of his own spectacular miscalculation. He had funded the monster. Then he had tried to disown it. The monster had not forgotten. To understand how a man of that wealth and that intelligence could end up on both sides of the same catastrophe, you have to go back much further. You have to go back to 1817, to a small village called Essen-Werden on the eastern bank of the Rhine, where a man named August Thyssen Sr. was born into a family of minor merchants with modest means and outsized ambition. What most people don't know is that the Thyssen fortune didn't begin with genius. It began with timing. The Ruhr Valley in the mid-19th century was undergoing the most dramatic industrial transformation in European history. Coal was being extracted at unprecedented scale. The German railroad network was expanding at roughly 1,000 kilometers per year through the 1850s and 1860s. Iron, and later steel, was the connective tissue of this entire transformation. Someone was going to get rich. The question was who? August Thyssen Sr. positioned his son, August Thyssen Jr., born in 1842, to be that someone. Let me take you back to 1871. The Franco-Prussian War has just ended. Germany has emerged victorious, unified under Bismarck, intoxicated with nationalist momentum, and flush with French reparations that amounted to 5 billion gold francs. Investment capital was flooding into German industry at a rate the continent had never seen. A young August Thyssen Jr., then 29 years old, watched all of this from a small rolling mill in Duisburg that he'd purchased for a modest sum with family money. The smell of that mill, coal smoke, hot metal, the acrid bite of slag, would have been overwhelming. The heat was constant. Workers moved in organized rhythms around furnaces that burned at over 1,500 degrees Celsius. And standing somewhere in the middle of all of that, in his late 20s, was a man who understood something the other mill owners didn't yet. The future wasn't in making iron. The future was in controlling every stage of the process, from the coal in the ground to the finished steel beam, under one organizational roof. This wasn't just about metal. It was about leverage. Whoever controlled the supply chain controlled the price. And whoever controlled the price controlled entire industries. August Jr. spent the next 4 decades building exactly that kind of empire. By 1914, the Thyssen concern employed over 50,000 workers, operated mines across the Ruhr and Lorraine, ran its own railroad lines, owned its own port facilities, and had tentacles reaching into banking and shipping that most of his competitors didn't even know existed. He also fathered 5 children. The one who would inherit both the fortune and its catastrophic potential was born in 1873, Fritz Thyssen. Educated in Belgium and France, trained in law and business, fluent in multiple languages, and, from a very early age, convinced that his father's empire represented not just a commercial achievement, but a kind of German civilizational triumph. That belief would color every decision Fritz Thyssen made for the rest of his life. The empire wasn't just a business, it was a cause. And when he believed that cause was threatened, by communism, by instability, by the humiliations of Versailles, he would look for a protector with the same instinct a general looks for artillery. He would find one. But to understand what he was protecting and what he was willing to risk, we need to go back to the Ruhr in 1923, when the entire industrial order that August Thyssen had built seemed to be on the verge of collapse. The Ruhr Valley in 1871 was not a beautiful place. It was a landscape of perpetual grey, coal dust settling on rooftops, chimneys exhaling black columns into skies that hadn't seen blue in years, rivers running a muddy brown from runoff and industrial waste. Visitors from Paris or London would have found it oppressive. To August Thyssen Jr., it looked like opportunity compressed into geography. He purchased his first rolling mill that year with a combination of family funds and a personal loan. The mill at Duisburg processed iron into commercial sheet metal, wagon wheels, agricultural tools, basic construction materials. It was unglamorous work. The margins were thin, the competition fierce, and the labor conditions brutal, even by the standards of the time. Workers averaged 12-hour days for wages that barely covered rent in the cramped housing blocks that clustered around the factory gates. What set August apart wasn't generosity. It was strategic patience. Where other mill owners focused on cutting costs quarter by quarter, August was thinking in decades. He watched the German railroad network expand and understood that steel demand would follow exponentially. He studied how the largest American industrialists, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, had built their power not through individual assets, but through integrated systems. Control the coal, control the coke ovens, control the ore, control the transport. Then the price of steel is yours to set. By 1890, the Thyssen concern had acquired 4 coal mines in the northern Ruhr, 2 coke processing facilities, and a dedicated rail line connecting its operations to the Rhine River docks. This kind of vertical integration was not yet common in Germany. Most competitors were still operating as discrete businesses, miners who sold to cokers, who sold to steelmakers, who sold to fabricators. August had collapsed the entire chain into a single organism. The results were staggering. By 1900, the Thyssen steel operations were producing over 1 million tons of steel annually, roughly 10% of Germany's entire output, at a cost per ton that undercut competitors by 15 to 20%. The profit margins funded further acquisitions. The acquisitions increased the margins. The flywheel had begun to spin. You see, what August had created wasn't just a business empire. He had created infrastructure. His plants didn't just make steel. They were integral to the physical architecture of Imperial Germany. Railways, bridges, naval vessels, the Kaiser's expanding military apparatus ran partly on Thyssen steel. That relationship between industrial power and state power, the sense that the family and the nation were intertwined, embedded itself into the Thyssen identity at a foundational level. Fritz Thyssen absorbed this lesson as a young man, watching his father build. He understood that industrial empires weren't maintained by commerce alone. They required political stability. They required the right governments. They required, if necessary, the right men. He would spend the rest of his life acting on that understanding, and the consequences would reshape the world. By 1910, August Thyssen Jr. was 68 years old and one of the wealthiest private individuals in Europe. The numbers were almost incomprehensible in their scale. The Thyssen concern controlled assets valued at approximately 350 million German marks, the equivalent of several $billion in today's purchasing power. The company employed over 65,000 workers across its integrated operations. Its steel output ranked it among the top 5 producers on the continent. Its coal divisions were extracting over 8 million tons per year from mines that ran in some cases nearly a kilometer beneath the earth. But the scale alone doesn't capture what August had actually built. What he had built was a parallel economy, a self-contained system that touched almost every aspect of the lives of the people who worked within it. The company town around the main Thyssen works in Hamborn was effectively August's creation. He had funded its churches, its hospitals, its schools. Workers received housing through company-owned blocks. Their children were educated in facilities that August had helped endow. The paternalism was absolute and not entirely benevolent. It was also a mechanism of control, a way of tying the workforce to the company with bonds that extended far beyond a weekly paycheck. Here's the thing. This wasn't unusual for German industrial barons of the era. What was unusual was the sheer scope of August's ambition and the geographical reach of his operations. In 1902, August had made a move that shocked even his competitors. He purchased significant iron ore deposits in Normandy, France, the Thyssen mines at Caen, giving the family control over raw material sources outside German territory. This was strategic genius. It insulated the Thyssen operations from fluctuations in German domestic ore prices and created a supply chain that was, by design, difficult for any single government to disrupt. Look at the geopolitical subtext here. A German industrialist purchasing French resources 12 years before Germany and France would be locked in the deadliest war in human history to that point. The ore from those French mines would eventually go into steel that went into German weapons. The irony was not lost on observers at the time, though most were too financially entangled with August to say so publicly. Meanwhile, Fritz Thyssen was being groomed. He had studied at the Louvain Business School in Belgium, then completed an apprenticeship at the family firm. By 1900, he was already taking on managerial responsibilities. By 1907, he was a director. The transition of control was gradual, deliberate, and carefully managed by a father who understood that empires required succession planning. But the First World War complicated everything. When hostilities began in August 1914, the Thyssen operations shifted immediately to wartime production. The French mines were, of course, instantly inaccessible, and the conflict over the Lorraine iron ore region would become one of the central economic subplots of the entire war. August Thyssen died in April 1926. He was 83. By the time he died, Germany was already a different country from the one in which he had built his empire. The Kaiser was gone. The war had been catastrophically lost. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped Germany of the Lorraine ore fields, the same ones August had recognized as strategically critical decades before. The German economy was attempting to recover from hyperinflation so severe that workers had been paid twice daily in 1923 to spend their wages before they became worthless by afternoon. August had navigated none of this. He had died before the worst of it settled in. He left behind an empire that was, structurally, still intact, but operating in a political and economic environment that his methods had never been designed to handle. Fritz Thyssen inherited not just the assets, but the existential anxiety about their survival. He also inherited his father's conviction that great industrial power required the protection of a strong, sympathetic state. August had worked with Bismarck. He had cultivated relationships with the Kaiser's government. He had understood instinctively that political relationships were the bedrock on which commercial empires rested. Fritz had internalized this lesson completely. The question, in the fractious, unstable Germany of the mid-1920s, was which political force was strong enough, reliable enough, and sympathetic enough to deserve that investment. The Weimar Republic, in Fritz Thyssen's assessment, was none of those things. What he found instead, at a meeting he would later describe with a mixture of genuine enthusiasm and what reads in retrospect as tragic naivety, was a man who seemed to embody every quality the Thyssen Empire needed in a political protector. Fritz Thyssen met Adolf Hitler for the first time in 1923. The year 1923 was, by any measure, the worst year in German economic history. Inflation had been building since the war. The government had financed its wartime expenditures largely by printing money rather than raising taxes, and the Versailles reparations had accelerated the spiral. By the time January 1923 arrived, the exchange rate stood at approximately 18,000 marks to the dollar. That sounds extreme. It was about to become unrecognizable. In January 1923, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland, Fritz Thyssen's heartland, to enforce reparations payments that Germany had fallen behind on. The German government responded by calling for passive resistance. Workers would not cooperate with occupying forces. The government would pay their wages. Since the government had no money, it printed it. By November 1923, when Hitler attempted his failed beer hall putsch in Munich, the exchange rate had reached 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. Workers were being paid in wheelbarrows of currency that couldn't buy a loaf of bread by the time they reached the bakery. The savings of the German middle class, the merchants, the professionals, were obliterated. Fritz Thyssen watched all of this from the Ruhr. His industrial operations had been physically occupied by French troops. His workers were conducting the passive resistance campaign, meaning his factories were largely idle. He was losing money on an enormous scale, not from operational failure, but from political circumstance. The German state, in his view, was catastrophically weak. The communists were gaining strength. The Social Democrats couldn't hold anything together. Parliamentary democracy, as practiced in Weimar Germany, seemed constitutionally incapable of the decisive action that the crisis demanded. It was in this context that Fritz Thyssen attended a political meeting in Munich in late 1923, organized by Ludendorff, the First World War general who had become a nationalist political figure, where Adolf Hitler gave a speech. What most people miss about this moment is not the content of Hitler's speech, it's Fritz Thyssen's psychological state when he heard it. Here was a man who had inherited the most formidable industrial empire in Germany, watched it occupied by foreign troops, seen the currency evaporate into worthlessness, and was genuinely, viscerally terrified that a communist revolution was coming. Hitler offered a narrative. He offered villains, the November criminals, the war profiteers, the foreign powers, the internal enemies. He offered strength. He offered order. Thyssen was not an ideological follower. He was fundamentally a businessman making a political investment. He donated 100,000 gold marks to the Nazi Party in 1923, at a time when the party was genuinely on the fringes of German political life, when most of the establishment regarded Hitler as a vulgar street agitator with no serious future. Think about it. Without that infusion of Thyssen money at that specific moment of vulnerability, the Nazi Party's trajectory might have been fundamentally different. The beer hall putsch failed 2 weeks after that Munich meeting. Hitler went to prison. The party fractured. Without the prior injection of serious funding, and without the implicit credibility that Thyssen's endorsement carried in conservative circles, it might not have survived the crisis. It survived. Fritz Thyssen continued his support through the late 1920s. He helped facilitate Hitler's meetings with other industrialists and financiers. He used his social connections, his membership in the exclusive Düsseldorf Industry Club, his relationships with bankers and manufacturers, to gradually normalize Hitler in spaces where he would otherwise have been unwelcome. The January 1932 Düsseldorf Industry Club speech is particularly significant. Hitler addressed an audience of Germany's most powerful industrialists, many of whom remained skeptical. Fritz Thyssen had helped arrange the invitation. The speech lasted 2.5 hours. Hitler promised to destroy the trade unions, crush the communists, and rebuild German economic strength. Here's what's interesting. Thyssen's motivations were never simply ideological. He was genuinely terrified of communism, genuinely convinced that parliamentary democracy was inadequate to the German crisis, and genuinely believed, with the extraordinary confidence of a man who had never encountered a problem he couldn't outspend, that Hitler was a tool he could direct. He believed, as many members of the conservative establishment believed, that once in power, Hitler would moderate, that the radical fringe elements would be contained, that the serious business of governing would discipline the movement's wilder tendencies. He was catastrophically wrong. But in early 1932, the catastrophe was still just a political miscalculation on paper. By January 1933, it was something else entirely. January 30th, 1933. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Fritz Thyssen was 59 years old. He had spent the better part of a decade investing in this outcome, financially, socially, politically. He had helped legitimize a movement that most serious German conservatives had initially dismissed. He had opened doors, written checks, made introductions, and now the investment had, in the crudest business sense, paid off. In the immediate aftermath of Hitler's appointment, Thyssen's relationship with the regime was conspicuously close. He was among the first major industrialists to join the Nazi Party formally, Doing so in 1933, he was appointed to the Prussian State Council, an advisory body whose symbolic significance was considerable. His membership signaled to the German business community that the Nazi government had the blessing of the old industrial establishment. His steel empire, meanwhile, received what might be called a favorable operating environment. Labor unions, the organized worker movements that had been a source of constant friction for industrial employers throughout the Weimar years, were abolished in May 1933. The communists were arrested. The Social Democrats were dissolved. The labor movement was replaced by the Nazi-controlled German Labor Front, which existed to organize workers in service of national production goals rather than to advocate for their interests. From Thyssen's immediate perspective, the new Germany was operating almost exactly as he had hoped. But behind the scenes, the relationship was already more complicated than it appeared. You see, the Nazi regime's economic program was not simply a defense of traditional German industry. It was an aggressive expansion of state intervention into the economy. Göring's four-year plan, which began in 1936, directed industrial production toward rearmament with an intensity that disrupted normal commercial calculations. Fritz Thyssen had a businessman's instincts, and those instincts were increasingly troubled. He watched the regime absorb control over pricing, over foreign exchange, over the labor market. He watched fellow industrialists who pushed back against regime directives face consequences ranging from official displeasure to outright expropriation. He also watched something that his initial investment calculations had entirely failed to account for: the accelerating radicalization of Nazi policy toward Jewish Germans. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 had stripped Jewish citizens of their legal status. The Aryanization program, the forced transfer of Jewish-owned businesses to non-Jewish Germans, was intensifying through the late 1930s. Kristallnacht, in November 1938, made the regime's intentions unmistakable to anyone willing to look directly at them. Thyssen's position on these developments was, to put it charitably, ambiguous. There is evidence that he privately objected to specific elements of anti-Jewish policy, that he found the crude racial ideology aesthetically repugnant and practically disruptive to business relationships. He later claimed he had made private protests to regime officials. But here's the thing: he didn't resign, he didn't publicly dissent, he didn't withdraw his support, not in 1935, not in 1936, not in 1937. The steel empire continued operating. The relationship between the Thyssen concern and the Nazi state remained intact. What shifted Thyssen, what finally broke the relationship, was not the treatment of Jewish Germans or the systematic destruction of democratic institutions. It was foreign policy. The annexation of Austria in March 1938 troubled him. The Sudetenland crisis in the autumn of 1938 alarmed him more seriously. Fritz Thyssen had lived through the First World War. He understood at a visceral level what a European military conflict actually cost, not in abstract terms, but in the specific destruction of the industrial infrastructure he had spent his life building and protecting. In September 1939, 3 days after Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began, Fritz Thyssen sent letters to Rudolf Hess and Hermann Göring. They were acts of political suicide. He expressed his opposition to the war. He stated that Germany was heading toward catastrophe. He demanded to be heard. The response from the regime was swift and cold. Thyssen fled Germany in late 1939, traveling first to Switzerland and then to France. He had taken his wife Amélie with him. Along with what financial resources he could move through the banking channels, the family had spent years quietly cultivating in neutral countries. He would not return to Germany as a free man. Consider the full arc of what had just happened. A man who had invested enormously in Hitler's political rise, who had helped legitimize and finance the movement from its earliest days, had now become a refugee from the regime he had helped create. His assets in Germany were confiscated. His industrial empire was placed under Nazi administration. What he had built had been taken by the very forces he had funded to protect it. This wasn't just irony. This was a paradigmatic demonstration of the fundamental error in his entire political calculus, the belief that radical movements, once empowered, remain tools of their funders. They don't. They become something else entirely. But Fritz Thyssen's story, and the Thyssen family's story, was far from over, because while Fritz was fleeing into exile, the money hadn't gone anywhere. When Fritz Thyssen fled Germany in 1939, he left behind something more complicated than a steel empire. He left behind a network of financial relationships, banks, shell companies, holding structures that had been quietly assembled over decades, partly through his own initiative and partly through the work of advisors who understood that the safest assets were the ones governments couldn't easily see. The most important node in this network was a small but well-connected bank in New York, the Union Banking Corporation, located at 39 Broadway in Manhattan. The Union Banking Corporation had been established in 1924 as a joint venture between a Dutch bank controlled by Fritz Thyssen's family concerns, the Bank for Handel and Scheepvaart, and the American banking firm Brown Brothers Harriman. The American partners included Prescott Bush, father of future U.S. President George H.W. Bush and grandfather of George W. Bush. Let me put this in perspective. Through this banking arrangement, Thyssen family assets were being managed in New York through a firm that included among its partners a man whose descendants would occupy the White House. This was not a fringe arrangement. This was the normal architecture of international high finance. The Union Banking Corporation's primary function was to handle financial transactions between the Thyssen industrial operations and their international counterparts, moving money across borders, managing foreign exchange, facilitating the kind of capital flows that large industrial enterprises require. But as the Nazi regime consolidated power through the 1930s, the context around that banking relationship changed dramatically. The UBC continued operating after Hitler came to power. It continued handling Thyssen-connected assets through the late 1930s. It was still active when the Second World War began. When the US entered the war following Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Treasury Department's Office of Alien Property Custodian began examining financial institutions with connections to enemy nations. In October 1942, the Union Banking Corporation was seized under the Trading with the Enemy Act. Its assets were frozen. The investigation that followed documented its connections to the Thyssen industrial apparatus, and through that, to the Nazi war economy. The episode was not prosecuted as criminal. The bank's American partners, including Prescott Bush, were not charged. The legal position taken was essentially that the American partners had been managing legitimate financial assets without direct knowledge of their ultimate connection to the Nazi state apparatus. The truth was considerably more complicated. What the documents reveal is that the line between legitimate international finance and material support for the Nazi regime was genuinely blurry in ways that were convenient for a great many people. Meanwhile, Fritz Thyssen himself was in far more immediate trouble. When France fell to Germany in June 1940, Thyssen was still in France. He attempted to flee to South America, but was apprehended, and then, in an extraordinary twist, was handed over to German authorities. The Vichy French government, eager to demonstrate cooperative spirit with its occupiers, delivered Fritz Thyssen back to the Reich he had helped create. He was taken to Germany and placed under what the Nazis called Ehrenhaft, a kind of privileged custody that acknowledged his former status while keeping him firmly under control. By 1941, he had been transferred to a series of concentration camps, Sachsenhausen, then Dachau, where he was held as a Sonderhäftling, a special prisoner kept alive but confined, removed from public life. The contrast is almost unbearable when you sit with it. Fritz Thyssen had provided critical early funding for the movement that built those camps. He had helped legitimize the political force that ordered their construction. He had opened doors for Hitler in rooms full of Germany's most powerful men, and now he was imprisoned in the system those actions had helped create. What did he think about in his cell at Dachau? We have some record. Thyssen had, before his flight, worked with a journalist named Emery Revis to write a memoir. The book, published in 1941 under the title I Paid Hitler, was one of the most remarkable acts of public confession in the history of industrial capitalism. Thyssen acknowledged in direct terms that he had provided significant financial support to Hitler and the Nazi movement. He described his reasoning: the fear of communism, the distrust of Weimar, the belief that Hitler could be managed, and he described his disillusionment in terms that were genuine, however self-serving they also were. I Paid Hitler. The title was an act of confession and a public appeal at once. He was trying to establish that he had turned against the regime, which was true, and to create a documentary record of his opposition, which was also true, though conveniently timed. What the book could not fully reckon with was the arithmetic of consequence. The money he had provided in 1923, in 1929, in 1932 had not merely funded meetings and pamphlets. It had helped a political movement survive its most vulnerable years. The path from that 100,000 gold mark donation to the gas chambers of Auschwitz was not direct, but it was traceable, and no amount of later disillusionment changed the trajectory of the chain of events those early investments had helped set in motion. That reckoning would hang over the Thyssen name for decades. The fortune, however, had other plans. In the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from both east and west, the administrators of the Thyssen industrial empire faced a practical question. What happens to the assets now? The Thyssen operations had spent the war years operating under Nazi administration. The Vereinigte Stahlwerke, the consolidated steel trust that represented the core of the Thyssen industrial inheritance, had been a central element of the German war economy. Its plants had produced steel for tanks, aircraft, submarines, artillery. Its labor force had been supplemented, in the brutal calculus of wartime production, with forced workers, concentration camp prisoners, prisoners of war, foreign laborers conscripted from occupied territories. This last fact would prove to be one of the most enduring complications in the post-war story of the Thyssen legacy. The use of forced labor in German wartime industry was widespread, not unique to the Thyssen operations by any means. Historians estimate that by 1944, over 7 million forced foreign workers were employed in Germany, along with hundreds of thousands of concentration camp prisoners. The Thyssen plants at Hamborn, Duisburg, and across the Ruhr had used forced labor. The records are unambiguous, but in the immediate aftermath of the German surrender in May 1945, the full accounting of what that meant in legal, financial, and moral terms was still being assembled. The Allies were simultaneously managing the physical occupation of Germany, conducting the Nuremberg war crimes trials, attempting to reconstruct a shattered European economy, and beginning the early chess moves of what would become the Cold War. In that context, the question of exactly what to do with German heavy industry was not simple. On one hand, Thyssen and the other Ruhr steel producers had been central to the Nazi war machine. A strict accountability logic argued for significant penalties, asset confiscation, reparations obligations, potentially criminal prosecution of executives who had directly administered the forced labor programs. On the other hand, the Ruhr Valley was also the industrial heart of Western Europe. If it was dismantled or destroyed, the economic reconstruction of Germany, which the Western Allies increasingly recognized as essential to preventing Soviet expansion, would be severely compromised. This fundamental tension shaped every major decision about German industry in the late 1940s. Fritz Thyssen himself was tried by a German denazification court. The process was, to put it politely, inconsistent. Thyssen's case was complicated by his documented opposition after 1939, his imprisonment in the camps, and crucially, by his possession of his eventual repudiation of National Socialism. He was classified as a Belastete, one of the more serious categories of Nazi involvement, and faced the potential loss of most of his remaining German assets. The sentence, when it came, struck many observers as remarkably lenient. Thyssen was ordered to pay a fine and forfeit a portion of his remaining German holdings. Given the scale of his earlier involvement and the scale of the catastrophe that involvement had helped enable, it was a judgment that satisfied almost no one. He appealed. The sentence was reduced further on appeal. By 1950, the Thyssen family's German assets were substantially restored to family control through the complicated legal structures that German industrial families had become expert at deploying. The truth was that nobody, not the Allied authorities, not the German courts, not the international press, had a complete picture of where the Thyssen money actually was. Because while the German assets had been subject to scrutiny, the offshore assets, the Swiss accounts, the Dutch holding companies, the South American investments, the residual connections to the New York banking relationships, were operating in a different world entirely. International financial regulation in 1945 was not what it would eventually become. The tools for tracking capital across borders were rudimentary. The political will to pursue industrial fortunes through neutral country banking systems was limited, and the Thyssen family had been moving assets offshore for a very long time. The most rigorous accounting of the Thyssen offshore fortune wouldn't come until the 1990s and early 2000s, when investigative journalism, academic historical research, and legal proceedings in multiple countries began assembling a more complete picture. Fritz Thyssen died in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in February 1951. He was 77 years old. His wife Amélie had died there 6 weeks earlier. They had spent their final years in South American exile, surrounded by the company of other German émigrés, existing in the strange, social world of wealthy Germans who had managed to escape the specific consequences of their actions while carrying the knowledge of what those actions had meant. He never fully acknowledged the depth of his responsibility for what his early support had helped make possible. He acknowledged that he had made serious errors of judgment. He never reckoned, in any documented public statement, with the specific lives those errors had cost. The money outlived him, as money tends to do, and it was the money in the end that carried the Thyssen story into its most complex and strangest chapter. The Thyssen family fortune did not disappear when Fritz died in 1951. It transformed. The German industrial assets, the steel operations, the mining concerns, the processing facilities were restored to family control in the early 1950s as the West German virtuous wonder, the economic miracle, began generating extraordinary returns. German industry, rebuilt with Marshall Plan capital, was by the mid-1950s producing at levels that approached and in some cases exceeded pre-war highs. The Thyssen-style operations were central to this recovery. Fritz's son, Heinz Thyssen-Bornemisza, who had, through a combination of legal maneuvering in the family's offshore financial structures, maintained control over the non-German portions of the fortune during the war years, now became the primary steward of the reconstituted family wealth. Heinz was a different kind of Thyssen. Where his father Fritz had been publicly visible and operationally involved, Heinz retreated into privacy. He operated through the web of holding companies and banking relationships that had been his father's legacy. He lived principally in Lugano, Switzerland, and later in Monaco. He collected art, obsessively, systematically, with the acquisitive intensity that tends to characterize people who have inherited more money than any single lifetime of effort could have generated. The Thyssen-Bornemisza art collection would eventually become one of the largest private art collections in the world, over 1,500 works spanning 5 centuries, including pieces by Rubens, Caravaggio, Holbein, and Van Eyck. Many of these works were displayed in the family's Villa Favorita on Lake Lugano, which operated as a private museum with selective public access. Art served multiple purposes. It was a genuine passion. It was also, less sentimentally, an excellent store of value. Portable, internationally recognized, largely exempt from the kinds of scrutiny that financial assets attracted, and capable of appreciating dramatically over time. What most people don't know is that the provenance of some pieces in the Thyssen-Bornemisza collection attracted scrutiny decades later. A significant portion of the collection had been acquired in Europe during the 1930s and 1940s, a period when Jewish families throughout Nazi-controlled territory were being forced to sell their assets at catastrophically reduced prices or having them confiscated outright. The question of whether any Thyssen acquisitions during that period involved looted art has been the subject of ongoing research and several legal proceedings. Hans Heinrich Thyssen-Bornemisza, the next family patriarch, became the most public and flamboyant of the Thyssen heirs. He married 5 times, maintained residences across multiple countries, and became a regular presence in the international society pages. He also negotiated one of the most consequential art transactions of the late 20th century. In 1993, after years of negotiation with multiple governments, Hans Heinrich reached an agreement with the Spanish government to sell the bulk of the Thyssen-Bornemisza collection to Spain for approximately $350 million. The collection became the foundation of the Museo Nacional Thyssen-Bornemisza in Madrid, which opened to the public in 1992 and today attracts over 1 million visitors annually. It is, in some respects, the most visible public legacy of the Thyssen family. Tourists walk through galleries containing centuries of European artistic achievement, perhaps unaware that the fortune that preserved and assembled those works had, at a crucial historical moment, helped underwrite the most destructive political project in modern history. The paradox is almost too neat for fiction. Art that outlasted the empire beauty purchased with industrial profit, some of which passed through the machinery of a genocidal state. This is not to say that every Thyssen artwork is tainted, or that the museum's cultural value is negated by its origins. The works themselves are not guilty, but the context matters. By the time Hans Heinrich died in 2002, the Thyssen family, in its various branches under various names and holding structures, remained one of the wealthiest dynasties in Europe. The German steel operations had been merged, through decades of consolidation, into ThyssenKrupp, still one of the largest industrial conglomerates in the world. The name on the buildings was the same name that August Thyssen Jr. had put above the gates of his Ruhr Valley mills in the 1870s. The families that bore that name had, across 5 generations, built and lost and rebuilt and obscured and transferred a fortune that began in the coal dust of the Ruhr and passed through one of history's darkest corridors. The most fascinating and troubling chapter of the Thyssen story is not the one that happened in public. It is the one that happened in the ledgers. For most of the post-war decades, the full extent of the Thyssen family's offshore financial architecture remained genuinely obscure, not just to the public, but to historians and to the various government bodies that had tried to assess it. What was known was incomplete. What was documented was partial, and the gaps were not accidental. The core of the offshore structure was the network of Dutch and Swiss holding companies that Fritz Thyssen had built and maintained from the 1920s onward. The Bank for Handel and Scheepvaart in Rotterdam was the central vehicle. Through it, Thyssen family assets moved in and out of the Union Banking Corporation in New York, through Swiss bank accounts, and into various investment structures in neutral countries. After the war, these structures were not dismantled. They were quietly consolidated. The legal entities that had provided opacity under wartime conditions continued to provide opacity under peacetime conditions. International financial regulation in the 1950s and 1960s was not equipped to pierce corporate veils across multiple jurisdictions. The Union Banking Corporation connection is worth examining in detail. When the UBC was seized by the US government in 1942, under the Trading with the Enemy Act, its total assets were approximately $3 million, modest by Thyssen standards. But the UBC was not where the money was stored. It was where the money was moved. The actual assets were in the Dutch and Swiss structures that the UBC was administering. Seizing the UBC disrupted the plumbing. The reservoir was elsewhere. After the war, the seized UBC assets were returned to their owners through a US legal process that restored assets to anyone who could demonstrate they hadn't violated the Trading with the Enemy Act through criminal intent. The Thyssen-connected portions were subject to more complicated negotiations. The documentation of exactly what happened to those assets, how they were restored, to whom, in what amounts, remains incomplete. The investigative journalist Gerhard Jahn, writing in the early 2000s, traced elements of the Thyssen offshore structure through decades of corporate filings, bank records and legal documents obtained through Freedom of Information requests in multiple countries. What he found was a picture of extraordinary sophistication. Holding companies that owned holding companies that owned shares in other holding companies, with beneficial ownership structures designed to make it genuinely difficult to identify the ultimate human beings who controlled the assets. Here's the thing. The Thyssen family's post-war strategy was not to deny the family's wartime history. Fritz had already confessed it publicly in I Paid Hitler. The strategy was, more subtly, to separate the family name from its financial architecture, to maintain the public narrative of industrialists who had been compromised by a terrible historical moment while keeping the financial structures quietly operating. The art collection served this strategy brilliantly. The Thyssen-Bornemisser art was beautiful, internationally prestigious, culturally significant. It made the family name synonymous with cultural patronage rather than industrial complicity. The Madrid Museum, visited by millions, celebrated by art historians, studied by school children, became the primary association with the Thyssen name for people who had no reason to dig into the 1923 check or the Union Banking Corporation. In 2007 and into the 2010s, ThyssenKrupp established historical research projects examining the company's wartime history, including the use of forced labor. These projects were genuine scholarly endeavors, producing detailed historical accounts. Compensation programs for surviving forced laborers or their descendants had been established through broader German industry funds. These are not nothing. They represent a form of institutional acknowledgement that many comparable entities never achieved. But the scale of the acknowledgement and the scale of the original complicity were not by any reasonable measure equivalent. The money was too big. The history was too consequential. The paper trail, even when followed with the most determined investigative energy, disappeared too often into the welcoming darkness of bank secrecy and corporate opacity. The fortune survived. The accounting did not. The story of the Thyssen family is not over. That is perhaps its most unsettling quality. The events described in this documentary are not safely historical in the way that wars or elections are historical, concluded, catalogued, assigned to a specific past. The financial structures built by the Thyssen family, the industrial entities that bear the name, the artworks assembled with a portion of the fortune, all of these continue to exist to generate returns, to influence the world in ways that are continuous with the choices made a century ago. ThyssenKrupp, as of the early 2020s, employs approximately 100,000 people in over 50 countries. Its divisions produce steel, manufacture submarines for the German Navy, build elevators, design industrial equipment, and operate across the full range of modern industrial activity. It is a publicly traded company, subject to contemporary corporate governance standards, with majority ownership no longer held by any single family interest. The Thyssen-Bornemisza art collection in Madrid remains one of Europe's premier art museums. The provenance research that has been conducted on the collection has resolved some disputed works and flagged others for ongoing investigation. The museum's scholarly staff are engaged in ongoing work to document the acquisition history of individual pieces. Both of these things, ThyssenKrupp's contemporary operations and the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum, exist within legitimate institutional frameworks. They employ thousands of people doing ordinary work. They contribute to cultural and economic life in ways that are, evaluated on their own terms, unambiguously valuable. And yet, the question that the Thyssen story poses, and that it refuses to resolve neatly, is the question of how wealth accumulates its history and what obligations that history creates. Consider the specific numbers. The 100,000 gold marks that Fritz Thyssen donated to the Nazi Party in 1923 was not, in itself, a transformative sum. The Nazi Party was not built on Thyssen money alone, but the elite financial support, Thyssen support specifically, mattered at specific moments. It mattered in 1923, when the party was financially precarious. It mattered in the early 1930s, when Thyssen's facilitation of Hitler's access to conservative industrialist circles helped legitimize a movement that many of those industrialists might otherwise have continued to ignore or oppose. Fritz Thyssen made specific choices. Those choices had specific consequences. The consequences included, among much else, the deaths of 6 million Jewish people, the deaths of tens of millions of soldiers and civilians across 2 continents, the physical destruction of much of urban Europe, and the imposition of totalitarian rule over half a continent for 2 generations. No individual choice caused all of that, but some choices made the path to it smoother, faster, and more likely. What's interesting is how comprehensively the major historical actors in this story failed to fully reckon with that question on their own. Fritz Thyssen wrote a confession, spent years in Nazi camps and died in exile. His reckoning was real but self-serving, focused on his own suffering rather than on the suffering his choices had contributed to. Heinz Thyssen-Bornemisza retreated into private wealth and art collecting. Hans Heinrich Thyssen-Bornemisza became a cultural philanthropist of international stature while consistently deflecting deeper scrutiny. When you step back and look at the full picture, what the Thyssen story illuminates is something larger than one family's moral failures. It illuminates the structural difficulty of holding concentrated wealth accountable across time. Empires of capital, once established, develop their own momentum, their own strategies for survival. They outlast the individuals who made the choices. They migrate across borders, change their names, transform their form, and continue accumulating. The real lesson here isn't that Fritz Thyssen was a uniquely evil man. He wasn't. He was a wealthy, frightened, ideologically conservative businessman who made a catastrophic political investment and spent the rest of his life trying to outrun its consequences. What is unique is the scale of the wealth, and the scale of what that wealth helped set in motion. So the question remains, when wealth participates in catastrophe, Does it carry that history in perpetuity? Does the steel company that employs 100,000 workers today bear any relationship to the check written in Munich in 1923? Does the museum that educates millions of visitors about Rubens and Caravaggio owe any particular accounting for the context in which some of its pieces were acquired? These are not comfortable questions. They are not questions that can be answered in a single documentary. But they are the questions that the Thyssen story insists on asking, whether we like it or not. So we've seen how a single industrial dynasty, built with genuine brilliance and sustained with ruthless strategic thinking, found itself at the center of the 20th century's defining catastrophe. The Thyssen story spans 3 generations and 150 years. It begins with a young man purchasing a rolling mill in the industrial grey of the Ruhr Valley in 1871 and ends, if it ends anywhere, with a museum in Madrid that 2 million visitors walked through last year, perhaps without knowing the full story of the fortune that assembled it. The elements of that story are each individually comprehensible. August Thyssen built a great industrial empire through genuine talent and extraordinary strategic vision. Fritz Thyssen inherited that empire and, terrified of losing it, made a political investment that seemed, in the specific context of 1923, like a rational calculation. The investment went catastrophically wrong. The assets survived anyway, protected by financial architectures built precisely for the purpose of surviving catastrophe. Today, the Thyssen name exists in 2 primary contexts: an industrial conglomerate employing hundreds of thousands of people across the global economy, and a world-class art museum in the Spanish capital. Both represent genuine value. Both are the products of a history that includes specific moral failures of enormous consequence. The modern relevance is not abstract. The questions raised by the Thyssen story about the relationship between concentrated wealth and political power, about the accountability of capital across generations, about what obligations are created when financial structures participate in catastrophe, are precisely the questions that democratic societies continue to grapple with in the 21st century. The architecture of offshore finance that the Thyssen family helped pioneer, the interlocking holding companies, the neutral country banking relationships, the separation of beneficial ownership from nominal control, is the same architecture that enables contemporary wealth to maintain opacity and mobility in ways that frequently outpace the regulatory frameworks designed to constrain it. That's not an accident. It is the accumulated institutional memory of families who learned that the most durable asset is not steel or art. It is opacity. The final insight, the one that reframes the entire story, is this. Fritz Thyssen is often described as a man who made a terrible mistake, a tragic figure who misjudged a political movement and paid a personal price. But the framing of individual mistake obscures the structural reality. The mistake was not an aberration. It was a predictable output of a system in which extreme concentrations of wealth create extreme political anxiety, and that anxiety creates a specific vulnerability to authoritarian promises of protection. Fritz Thyssen was not unique. He was a recurring type. The specific danger is not the individual actor, it is the structural condition that produces him. The Thyssen dynasty rose in the industrial fires of the 19th century, bankrolled the darkest political movement of the 20th, and survived into the 21st with its assets largely intact and its name on one of the world's great museums. That is a story about history, but it is also uncomfortably a story about now.